back in 1800, 90% of the world was living in abject poverty, and
Mhm.
now it's less than 10%. And even going back to 1990, I'm convinced there were about 2 billion people living in abject
Mhm.
poverty, and now it's about 600
Mhm.
million, or it's about a third of that 2 billion population. And I am convinced that it was the fall of the wall, the end of the Soviet Union, and globalization that has made that possible. And what you're doing is trying to fix the remaining 600 million, or whoever these folks are living on the margins. And one of the things that you talk about is frontline regions. So what are these frontline regions, or what is meant by frontline regions?
When we think about where organizations are and how do we understand regions, I don't think we can use national borders anymore to understand what it is. So if you take, I was just in Kenya. Like, Nairobi is an incredibly international city. Busia is a little less so, right? Take Colombia, for example, where you have three amazing, beautiful cities.
Amazing country. Amazing. Medellin is one of my all-time favorite cities.
Just stunning. But the experience of somebody living in Medellin and on the borders of Cali or Venezuela, very different experiences. And so we're not trying to create a construct here, there are enough constructs, but I think that there's a difference between the places that are invested in, that are on tourist brochures or vacation rentals, or people's schedules. Those are the urban cities in countries are easily very well invested in. Like, I'm going to Bishkek on Saturday, and it's one of my favorite cities in the world. Great coffee shops, amazing people. Like, it's just wonderful. But there's a difference between being there and being in Marin. And when we think about the next levels of investment, we often think about countries. But in fact, there are many areas in countries that are really saturated and other areas that have absolutely no investment. And so this frustration of dealing with national borders to talk about, because that's where we collect data, right? World Bank, national governments. But it is really this bifurcation of developing countries, which may seem at a macro level to be saturated with investment, but actually where that's concentrated 100 miles from an international airport.
Yeah, there was a book written about 20 years ago, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. You reference it in your book, and I read that, and I remember reading it about 20 years ago and thinking, okay, yes, we can very simply identify these places by country. And to your point, we can't do that anymore. And I think one of the examples in the book is Ghana. And Ghana, from my understanding, flourishes in some places. And where you're talking, it's not flourishing. There's a religious minority where you're talking about. So maybe just talk about that and maybe one other example to help people understand what these frontline regions look like.
For sure. I mean, Ghana is a great example because Accra has some of the best pizza I've ever had, has a Second Cup Coffee Company, which is a Canadian, like the Canadian Starbucks. You walk into Accra and you're like, oh, there's Second Cup here, and it's a wonderful, all of Ghana is wonderful, but it becomes kind of less and less developed as you go north. And, by the time you're up at the border in Burkina, there's a lot less infrastructure. There's more poverty. You see fewer tin roofs and brick houses and more thatched roofs. You see, more separation. You see fewer nice cars, and the country changes. And so although Ghana is, for many people, an emerging middle income country, there are people who live right on the border of Burkina where there has been huge amount of disruption. And it's very easy for that kind of disruption to spill over the border, right? And think about the fragility of peace. I think about Sudan, like South Sudan, it was always a little fragile, but Sudan was a stable, at least in the east, right? You thought about Darfur, but seeing that conflict spill over into the capital city and displace so many people. I mean, and so what I like about these examples is it shows the contrast between Ghana and Sudan, right? Is that very quickly regional conflicts and area can spill over, and so thinking about we really think about business as a tool for peace building. And so what you want is stability, and what you want is to be able to kind of hold off violence. One of the things that's really important is having people invested in peace, right? Imagine you are somebody who has a small shop in Ghana, northern Ghana, and you're on the border of Burkina, and there's a coup happening across the border. You probably are going to be a little less likely to buy inventory in bulk because you never know, right? Less likely to paint your house, less likely to keep those roots. And when we have those roots, we fight for peace. When we have those roots, we ask things from our government. I mean, one of the great things is that, paying taxes is a really important thing, not only just to give governments money, but also to have people expect something in return for their government, and that will be, when we think about those frontline regions, we think about places where any investment could actually help tip the balance between going backward into conflict or going forward into peace.